We would like to send out a special thanks to the fun and challenging Best Fiends, the infamously impossible to put down puzzle game. Download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the show. June 13th, 1977. Ohio County, West Virginia. Roberta Elam, a 26-year-old postulant known as Sister Robin who is planning to become a nun, leaves the motherhouse of the Mount St. Joseph convent. Hours later, Sister Robin's body is found on top of a hill in a meditation area, and she has been raped and strangled to death. There is speculation that her death might be connected to the murders of other young women which took place in neighbouring Washington County during the preceding months. In recent years, investigators have looked into a potential suspect who supposedly confessed to Sister Robin's murder, but have yet to uncover any conclusive evidence to link him to the crime. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring an horrific crime about a victim who was preparing to become a nun. The 1977 murder of Sister Roberta Elam. This case was originally suggested to me nearly 3 years ago by a listener named Cairo, and in late 2019, it was also explored by noted cold case investigator Paul Holes in an episode of his true crime TV series, The DNA of Murder. Roberta Elam was a postulant who had just joined the Sisters of St. Joseph and was known as Sister Robin at the time of her death. On the day she was killed, Sister Robin was staying at the Mount St. Joseph convent in Ohio County and had just begun an 8-day silent retreat in which she would contemplate and prepare for her final vows to become a nun. After walking to the secluded meditation area, Sister Robin was raped and murdered by an unknown assailant, who was brazen enough to commit this crime on convent grounds in broad daylight without being seen. During the early stages of the investigation, there was speculation that Sister Robin may have been the victim of a serial killer nicknamed the Washington Strangler, as no less than 4 other young women from neighboring Washington County had been sexually assaulted and murdered under similar circumstances in the preceding 7.5 months. As the years have gone by, some of these murders have been solved, and it seems likely that most of them are not connected to each other. In fact, a promising suspect has emerged in Sister Robin's murder, who may have been prematurely ruled out during the early stages of the investigation, but thus far, they've been unable to conclusively prove that he did it. So on this episode, we're not only going to explore Sister Robin's case, but also the other Washington County murders, as some of them are still unsolved to this day. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Sister Roberta Elam. Our story begins in West Virginia in 1977, and our central figure is 26-year-old Roberta Elam, who goes by the name Robin. Robin was originally born in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a family where she was the oldest of 4 siblings, but the Elams would later move to Illinois before settling in New Jersey. Robin decided to attend graduate school at Fordham University in New York in order to study theology, and she received a master's degree in religious education. She was described by everyone who knew her as an outspoken woman who was very passionate about social justice issues. At one point, she even expressed her desire to become a priest and found it outrageous that women were not allowed to do so. While attending Fordham, Robin became friends with Sister Kathleen Durkin, who was a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Wheeling, West Virginia. This inspired Robin to move there, where she went to work at the office for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston. Her responsibilities involved coordinating religious programs for adults and traveling to small towns alongside Sister Kathleen in order to teach adult religion classes. By the fall of 1976, after performing this job for over a year, Robin decided that she wanted to follow in Sister Kathleen's footsteps and join the Sisters of St. Joseph. Before she could officially become a nun, Robin had to undergo a period of training and preparation as a postulant, but she would still become known as Sister Robin. In June of the following year, Sister Robin moved into the motherhouse at Mount St. Joseph, an historic convent originally built in 1854, which is located in Ohio County, just a few miles outside of Wheeling. On June the 13th, she began an 8-day silent retreat, which would be dedicated to prayer and contemplation about taking her final vows to become a nun, and if Sister Robin decided to make that choice, Mount St. Joseph would become her permanent home. At 10:30 a.m., Sister Robin was last seen grabbing an apple inside the motherhouse's kitchen before she stepped outside. She also appeared to be carrying her prayer book and a canvas bag, but this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. 3.5 hours later, at around 2 p.m., the convent's caretaker went to the top of a hill located about 100 yards from the motherhouse. This was a secluded meditation area which overlooked the convent and contained a metal bench which the nuns would often use for prayer. But when the caretaker arrived, he discovered the bench had been overturned, and Sister Robin's body was lying on the ground about 40 yards from it. Her blouse and bra had been ripped and pulled up to expose her breasts, and her pants and underwear pulled down, so it appeared that she was sexually assaulted before she was murdered. Sister Robin had a mark on the left side of her face, and while she did not appear to have any defensive wounds, there were thumb impressions on her throat to indicate that her killer had strangled her to death with his bare hands. Since Sister Robin's prayer book and canvas bag were found near the overturned bench, she had likely been attacked while sitting or kneeling there, and an area of tall grass near the tree line was mashed down, which suggested that the perpetrator may have been lying in wait for her. After the Ohio County Sheriff's Office were informed about the murder, they performed an extensive search of the convent grounds and the surrounding properties. Mount St. Joseph was located in a very quiet rural area, and there were no fences or barriers to restrict access to outsiders. The property bordered a golf course belonging to the Spidal Golf Club at the Ogle Bay Golf Resort, and everyone who used the course that day was extensively questioned. Some of the nuns reported hearing loud voices around the approximate time period Sister Robin would have headed to the meditation area, but they figured the voices originated from the golf course and did not find them unusual at the time. While there were no sightings of any outsiders on the property, 2 eyewitnesses did report seeing a gray or faded blue 1969 two-door Chevrolet Impala parked on Pogue Run Road near the convent grounds sometime between 10:30 and 11:30 a.m. The vehicle was described as being rusted and dented and having what were likely West Virginia plates, and 3 decals were in the right corner of the rear window. One of the decals was related to coal mining, and the 2 others were religious, as one of them had a reference to Jesus on it. There was also a sticker on the rear bumper which had an image of hands praying, and there also appeared to be religious pamphlets in the back window. In addition, these 2 witnesses also reported seeing an unkempt white man in the car who was described as being in his early to mid-30s and just under 6 feet tall. He had a dark complexion, dirty black hair, black eyes, bushy eyebrows, as well as a beard and a mustache. He also appeared to be dressed in blue jeans and possibly a blue denim jacket. One of the witnesses said they saw the man exit the car and walk towards an embankment, which was below the hill where Sister Robin's body was found. A third witness would also recall having seen a man matching this description in the area in the days prior to the crime. While a composite sketch was created and circulated for this man, neither he nor the vehicle were ever identified. Investigators also looked into 4 men who worked for a crew from a salvage company based out of Atlanta, who had been in the area removing telephone cables from the poles 3 days before the murder. Sister Robin told some of the other nuns that she had words with one of the workers over obscene remarks he had made, but investigators never found any evidence to implicate any of the workers and did not consider them to be suspects. Mount St. Joseph was practically placed on a lockdown, as the other nuns were too fearful to venture outside alone for prayer or meditation. Sister Robin's best friend, Sister Kathleen, claimed that on the night before she was killed, Sister Robin said she needed to tell her something. According to Sister Kathleen, Sister Robin specifically stated, quote, "You will think I'm crazy," but ultimately never revealed what she wanted to say, and it was unclear if her cryptic statements had any connection to her death. Sister Robin did not have any known enemies, and since everyone from her personal life was eliminated as a suspect, it seemed likely that she was murdered by a stranger. Sister Robin's funeral would be attended by over 200 people from all different faiths, and she was laid to rest in Mount Calvary Cemetery in a section which was reserved for the Sisters of St. Joseph. There was fear in the community that the crime might be connected to a series of unsolved murders involving 4 other young women, which had taken place across the state line in neighboring Washington County, Pennsylvania. These other murders occurred during the preceding 7.5 months, so the Ohio County Sheriff's Office would coordinate their investigation with the Washington County Sheriff's Office and the Pennsylvania State Police. The first crime took place on the evening of November the 24th, 1976, when 21-year-old Susan Rush vanished after leaving her job at the G.C. Murphy department store at the Washington Mall in South Strabane Township, Pennsylvania. Susan was scheduled to meet her family at a local church for Thanksgiving Eve services, but she never arrived. The following evening, Susan's brother discovered her locked, abandoned car about a half-mile away from the Washington Mall and noticed that her bra and underwear were on the front seat. After he obtained a key to the car and opened the trunk, he discovered Susan's body inside. Her pants were torn and her sweater was turned inside out, and since an autopsy would reveal that Susan was sexually assaulted, she had likely been redressed. Susan's larynx had been crushed, and she had marks on her neck to indicate that she had been strangled to death, and there was speculation that she may have been strangled with a shoelace which was found missing from one of her shoes. On the evening of February the 13th, 1977, 16-year-old Mary Irene Jency left her home in North Charleroi to meet some friends, but she never showed up and was subsequently reported missing. 6 days later, her nude body was found in a wooded area in Fallowfield Township. She had been raped and beaten to death with a blunt instrument, causing multiple skull fractures and brain lacerations. Just over 1 month later, on the morning of March 17th, 17-year-old Debbie Capiola left her home in Findlay Township in order to catch the school bus, but she disappeared before the bus showed up. Even though she technically lived in neighboring Allegheny County, Debbie's body was discovered in a wooded section of Washington County 10 days later. She had been raped and strangled to death with the leg of her own blue jeans. On the evening of May 18th, 18-year-old North Strabane Township resident Brenda Lee Ritter drove off from her boyfriend's residence, but she never arrived home, and her abandoned car was found by the side of the road in South Strabane Township the following morning. The keys and Brenda's purse were still inside, though some of the purse's contents were spilled on the front seat. Later that same day, Brenda's nearly nude body was found on a hillside about a mile from her vehicle, and most of her clothes were scattered about 50 feet away. She had also been raped, and the killer had garroted her with her own underwear by using a stick to twist it tightly around her neck. By this point, word about the other unsolved homicides in Washington County had spread throughout the area, so Brenda's boyfriend and his mother advised her to keep her car doors locked before she drove away. But oddly, when her abandoned car was found, the driver's side door was unlocked and the window rolled down, even though a heavy thunderstorm had taken place that night. Sister Robin's murder took place less than 1 month later, and even though it occurred in Ohio County in a completely different state, there was speculation that all the crimes were connected and all 5 women were murdered by an unidentified serial killer. In fact, at one point, the press even nicknamed this individual the Washington Strangler. However, investigators never found any evidence to suggest that Sister Robin's case was linked to any of the other Washington County murders, as most of those victims had been strangled to death with a ligature, whereas Sister Robin's killer likely used their own hands. And unlike Sister Robin, the other victims appeared to have been murdered at different locations than where their bodies were ultimately found. Over the next few decades, a couple of the Washington County murders would actually be solved, and I'll provide additional details about these cases later on in the episode. But as the years have gone on, it seems more likely that each murder was committed by a different perpetrator. The investigation into Sister Robin's murder would remain dormant for the next few decades until the case was reopened in the early 2000s and evidence was submitted to a forensic laboratory. This led to a DNA profile being extracted that was believed to have belonged to the killer, and it would be uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System, aka CODIS. While no match has been made, the DNA has been used to eliminate dozens of potential suspects. In November of 2019, Sister Robin's case would be featured on an episode of the Oxygen True Crime series, The DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, and for the first time ever, the identity of a very promising suspect was revealed publicly. The individual in question was a man named John Shoplack, who had lived in Wheeling at the time, and supposedly revealed details about the crime which were not public knowledge. Shoplack was known for having a hatred towards Catholics and a history of violence. 1 month before Sister Robin's murder, Shoplack broke up with his girlfriend, and she alleged that he had once tried to choke her. He had also been accused of raping 2 other girls, and at one point, he was arrested for robbing his own grandmother. During the burglary, Shoplack cut off his grandmother's finger in order to steal a ring she was wearing, and wrapped a telephone wire around her neck to stop her from screaming. In September of 1977, one of Shoplack's friends came forward to police and claimed that Shoplack had bragged about having attacked and murdered a nun after approaching her from behind and strangling her with a belt. Shoplack also said that he got blood on him during the attack and stated that the victim was, quote-unquote, either a virgin or was coming on the rag. Well, it turned out that Sister Robin was a virgin and had been on her period when she was raped, and her tampon was never removed. Since this information was never revealed publicly, it suggested that Shoplack had inside knowledge of the crime, but after checking his military records, investigators learned Shoplack's blood type, and it turned out that it did not match blood from the murder scene, which was believed to belong to the attacker. For this reason, Shoplack was eliminated as a suspect, but according to Paul Holes, this should not have been done, since military records from that time period were known for having what he described as a, quote-unquote, fairly high error rate due to outdated technology and serology methods. Shoplack passed away in August of 2019, 3 months before the DNA of Murder episode aired, but since he was hospitalized prior to his death and underwent some medical procedures, investigators are hoping that Shoplack's tissue samples are still on file and could be compared with the killer's DNA profile. At the time of this recording, this process has not taken place, but Lieutenant Doug Ernest of the Ohio County Sheriff's Office has stated, quote, "This case will be an open case for us until there is a prosecution and a conviction of the person who did this horrible crime," end quote. But for the moment, the murder of Sister Roberta Elam continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a few moments to discuss our sponsor, Best Fiends. We're currently in the middle of summer, and I'm quite happy that after nearly a year and a half, things are starting to get back to normal again, which is super refreshing. For instance, I was recently able to see a movie on the big screen inside a cinema for the first time in over 16 months. But if you want your brain to feel like it's summertime all the time, one of the best ways to do so is to download and play Best Fiends, which is a terrifically fun activity any time of the year. It's been nearly 2 years since I began playing Best Fiends for the first time, and as you can imagine, it's very difficult to stop, and this past month, I managed to make it all the way to level 1700. Best Fiends is way more fun than all the other matching puzzle games out there, as you can play it for 30 minutes and become so engrossed that it only feels like 30 seconds have passed. And what's particularly great is that it's totally free to download and you never run out of new material. There are thousands of fun puzzles to solve and something new to explore every day. That's why even though I recently passed level 1700, I'm nowhere close to reaching the end. With Best Fiends, the adorable collectible characters just keep coming, and Best Fiends releases new challenges, characters, and themes all the time, just to keep you on your toes. I've recently unlocked some new characters and worlds which were not available before, and Best Fiends is very consistent about updating them. But the really fun part is how you can strategically team up with each character based on their special abilities to gain extra points and items to level up your Fiends. So if you want to enjoy this experience as much as I do, download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Give it a try. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. So even though Sister Robin was technically still a postulant and had not yet completed her final vows to become a nun, the fact that this murder took place on the grounds of an historic convent only about 100 yards from the main buildings was pretty shocking. I mean, there was no security at Mount St. Joseph at that time, and it would have been fairly easy for an outsider to sneak onto the property undetected, but I don't think anyone imagined that someone would be brazen enough to commit a crime as heinous as raping and murdering a nun, particularly in broad daylight. During the aforementioned DNA of Murder episode, Paul Hole spoke to some of the other nuns who were living at Mount St. Joseph at that time, including Sister Robin's best friend, Sister Kathleen Durkin. They discussed the possibility that someone on the inside, such as a priest, could have been responsible for the crime, and admittedly, when I first heard about the case and had not yet learned the full facts, I was wondering if that might be a possibility. I don't want to immediately default to sounding alarm bells about a cover-up with the Catholic Church, but there are documented cases of priests having murdered nuns, including one which took place less than 3 years after this. On April the 9th, 1980, 71-year-old Sister Margaret Ann Paul, who belonged to the Catholic Religious Sisters of Mercy, was stabbed 31 times and strangled to death inside a chapel at Mercy Hospital in Toledo, Ohio. Sister Margaret Ann was the caretaker there, and 24 years later, Father Gerald Robinson, a retired Catholic priest who had been one of the hospital's chaplains at that time, was arrested for the murder, and he was eventually convicted and received a sentence of life imprisonment before he died in prison in 2014. However, there's really nothing to suggest that a priest or anyone affiliated with the convent was responsible for the murder of Sister Robin. If they wanted to commit sexual assault and murder, it just seems a lot more logical that they would use their position to do it behind closed doors, rather than out in the open on top of a hill. While it was secluded, this meditation area was often used by the nuns for prayer, so there would be a risk of someone walking in on the crime as it was taking place. It really does seem like the killer was an outsider, though whether Sister Robin was specifically targeted, or if she was just a random victim who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, is not so clear. During an interview on the DNA of Murder episode, Sister Kathleen discussed the cryptic statement Sister Robin made on the night before she was killed, where she implied that she had something to tell her, and used the words, quote-unquote, "You will think I'm crazy." I've seen quite a few cases where a victim told a friend or family member that they had something important to reveal, but decided not to do so, and went missing or were murdered a short time later. It's easy to assume the victim was about to share information which had some sort of connection to what happened to them, but it's also possible that the timing was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. Investigators checked out everyone from Sister Robin's personal life and found nothing to indicate that she had any enemies or dark secrets. But even though she had joined the Sisters of St. Joseph, Sister Robin had not yet taken her final vows to become a nun, and on the day she was killed, she was beginning an 8-day silent retreat, where she would spend much of her time in contemplation about her ultimate decision. Some people in her life believe that Sister Robin still seemed a bit unsure about what exactly she wanted to do, so it was still not a 100% guarantee that she would elect to become a nun. According to her family, she was very passionate about social justice, and likely would have been heavily involved in activism if she lived, but she was also described as having a bit of a rebellious side, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to this lifestyle. So it's entirely possible that Sister Robin's cryptic statements to Sister Kathleen were somehow related to her making a decision about what to do with her life and had no relevance to her murder. I do not think this is a situation where, say, Sister Robin had a secret boyfriend she was planning to meet at the top of the hill that morning who ultimately decided to kill her. The evidence really seems to indicate that she was up there praying or in silent contemplation before she was taken by complete surprise by a stranger who attacked her. Even though the meditation area overlooked the convent and an adjacent golf course, the top of the hill was not actually visible from those locations below. So you have to wonder if the perpetrator was familiar enough with the spot that they knew they would be able to commit a sexual assault and murder up there without anyone seeing anything. It's also worth noting that Sister Robin was not actually wearing her nun's habit on the day she was killed, and was instead dressed in a white blouse and slacks. Since she was not instantly identifiable as a nun, it's unclear if that was the specific reason she was targeted. Of course, Sister Robin's murder hit the community pretty hard, and a lot of the publicity surrounding the crime was filled with speculation that it was connected to a series of unsolved murders which had taken place in Washington County during the preceding months. There was genuine fear that a serial killer nicknamed the Washington Strangler was targeting young women in the area, and Sister Robin was his latest victim. So before I discuss this case anymore, I have to talk about these additional murders. To get a sense of the geography, even though this crime took place in Ohio County, West Virginia, Mount St. Joseph is only about 12 miles west from the Pennsylvania state line, and the neighboring county is Washington County. The victims in these other cases were sexually assaulted, and all but one of them were strangled to death, so it's easy to understand why it might have been compelling to think all these crimes were linked. But like I mentioned earlier, 2 of the murders from Washington County have since been solved. When Mary Irene Jency was killed in February of 1977, she was beaten to death with a blunt instrument rather than strangled, and within months of the crime, a 19-year-old suspect named David DeVoley was arrested. Mary had reportedly been seen in his car shortly before her murder, but with no other evidence against DeVoley, prosecutors declined to press charges and he was released. However, in May of 2010, DeVoley and another suspect named Robert Irwin, who had been Mary's boyfriend at the time, were both charged with criminal homicide after DNA testing showed that sperm samples from Mary's pants matched Irwin, and a seminal stain in her underwear had a mixture of DNA profiles matching both Irwin and DeVoley. While this was not disclosed publicly back in 1977, Mary was 6 weeks pregnant at the time of her death, and Irwin was the unborn child's father, which gave him a motive for the crime. In exchange for testifying against Irwin and pleading guilty to the charges of tampering with physical evidence and hindering apprehension, DeVoley got a reduced sentence of 2 to 4 years in prison, as well as 2 years probation, and he has since been released. As for Irwin, after he was convicted of third-degree murder at trial, he received a sentence of 10 to 20 years, and he is still incarcerated today. So in the end, Mary's murder was a personal crime which had no connection to any of the other homicides. The other Washington County homicide to be solved was the murder of Debbie Capiola, which took place in March of 1977. Over 23 years later, DNA from a sperm sample on Debbie's genes linked the crime to a suspect named David Robert Kennedy, and he would eventually be convicted of first-degree murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment. Kennedy had been stalking Debbie, who usually walked to the school bus alongside her brother, but on the morning she was killed, Debbie happened to be alone, so Kennedy took advantage of the situation. DNA testing has ruled out Kennedy as being the killer of Sister Robin, and he is not believed to be responsible for any of the other Washington County murders. So technically, the murders of Susan Rush and Brenda Lee Ritter are still considered to be unsolved, but there's one other unsolved homicide which is worth mentioning. It took place only 5 days before Susan Rush was murdered and has a number of similarities, but since it technically took place in Allegheny County, it is not always lumped in with the other cases from Washington County. On November the 19th, 1976, 30-year-old Barbara Lewis was preparing to leave her home in Penn Hills in order to walk to the bus stop, and was last seen there by her sister when she left, at 6:15 a.m. But something obviously happened to Barbara because less than 3 hours later, her body was found inside a trash container outside the Brackenridge Civic Association about a mile away in the borough of Churchill. While she was not actually raped, her underwear was on inside out, her bra was torn, her shirt was missing, and her hands had been bound behind her back with a wool belt and one of her stockings. The killer likely strangled Barbara to death with their own hands and stuffed her mouth and nostrils with paper gauze. Brenda's missing shirt, coat, and purse were found in a wooded area near a cemetery a few days later, but unfortunately, there really isn't a lot of information about this case, and no promising suspects have ever popped up on the radar. The murder of Susan Rush took place on November the 24th, but there aren't any strong suspects in that case either, and no conclusive evidence that her case might be connected to Barbara's. But there is an interesting connection with Brenda Lee Ritter's case, as Susan had actually worked with Brenda's sister at the same G.C. Murphy department store prior to her murder, though that may be nothing more than a coincidence. As far as I know, there has never been any mention of DNA evidence in Barbara and Susan's murders, but a sample of the killer's DNA was found on Brenda's body. There's also been a prevalent theory in Brenda's case that she could have been murdered by a police officer or someone impersonating a police officer. Remember, Brenda's abandoned car was found by the side of the road with the driver's door unlocked and the window rolled down, even though there was a bad thunderstorm that night and she had been advised to keep her doors locked because of the paranoia surrounding all the other murders in the county. It's also worth mentioning that Brenda's driver's license was never found, so she may have pulled over and been ambushed in what she believed was a routine traffic stop. Interestingly enough, 2 days before Brenda's murder, Washington County Sheriff Hannah Johns lost his bid for re-election as the Democratic nomination for sheriff, and he fatally shot himself 1 week later. Johns' family insisted that his suicide was the result of him being despondent over his failure to get re-elected, but there were a number of rumors throughout the community that he may have taken his own life because he was Brenda's killer. However, Johns was thoroughly investigated and cleared by law enforcement, who never found any evidence to suggest he was involved in the crime. Even so, you do have to wonder what may have compelled Brenda to pull over that night, and I think the same question might apply to Susan's case, since she was last seen driving away in her car as well before her body was discovered inside the trunk. The only thing that seems clear about these crimes is that there was no Washington Strangler, and that most, if not all of the murders, were likely committed by different individuals and not some lone boogeyman serial killer. Theoretically, I guess it's still possible that the same person was responsible for the deaths of Barbara Lewis, Susan Rush, and Brenda Lee Ritter, but there's nothing to conclusively link them together either. Since there was DNA evidence in Brenda's case, I can only assume it did not match the DNA profile of Sister Robin's killer, which would rule out the possibility of those two crimes being connected. So unless there's any evidence to suggest otherwise, I can only believe that the murder of Sister Robin was a standalone crime, which has no link to any of the Washington County murders, and it's just an odd coincidence that so many young women were raped and strangled to death by different perpetrators in the same geographic region from November of 1976 until June of 1977. Of course, the big development in Sister Robin's case in recent years is that a promising suspect has been named publicly, John Shoplock. If you look at any of the original newspaper coverage of this case, Shoplock is not mentioned anywhere, and I never heard his name until the DNA murder of episode aired in November of 2019, 3 months after Shoplock's death. While there is very little information out there about Shoplock, the information which is available makes him sound like a very violent person who might be capable of a crime like this, though, as far as I can tell, he has never been linked to any other murders. Of course, the most damning evidence against Shoplock is that he allegedly told a friend of his that he had murdered a nun and provided details about the crime which are not public knowledge at that time. Indeed, looking through old newspaper articles from 1977, there is definitely no mention about Sister Robin being a virgin who was on her period and still had her tampon inserted when she was raped. It would be one thing if Shoplock's friend had come forward with this story years after the fact, but he spoke to police only 3 months after the crime took place. If they had today's technology back then, this crime might have been solved, but DNA testing was still not a thing yet, and it seems like investigators ruled out Shoplack as a suspect based purely on what might have been very flawed and outdated methods for determining his blood type. All that being said, I would be interested to know if there's any other compelling evidence which might link Shoplack to the crime. It seemed like for decades, the strongest lead in this case were the eyewitness sightings of a man who was seen in a 1969 Chevrolet Impala parked by the side of the road near Mount St. Joseph on the morning of the murder. The Impala was also described as having very distinct decals, so did Shoplack own or have access to such a vehicle with these decals in 1977? The man was also described as having black hair, bushy eyebrows, and a beard, and being in his early to mid-30s, and Shoplack would have been 25 years old at that time. The only photograph of Shoplack which appears to be available online is a mugshot which was taken of him when he was arrested for a minor offense in 2002. He's clean-shaven in the photo, and since 25 years have passed, it's impossible to determine if he has much of a resemblance to the man from the composite sketch. And of course, even though the timeline fits, we can't even be 100% certain that the bearded man seen near the Impala was actually Sister Robin's killer. We do have one eyewitness who claimed they saw a man matching this description in the area a few days before the murder, and if Shoplack really did have an immense hatred for Catholics and knew this was a Roman Catholic convent, perhaps he was scouting the place beforehand and figured the meditation area was a secluded enough place to attack someone without being seen. If another nun besides Sister Robin had traveled to the top of the hill that morning, perhaps she would have been murdered instead. So it's been nearly 2 years since that DNA of Murder episode aired, and I wondered if there was any progress with obtaining Shoplack's tissue samples and comparing them to the killer's DNA profile. Well, coincidentally enough, while I was preparing this episode, the Murder Squad podcast co-hosted by Paul Holes and Billy Jensen released their own episode about the Washington Strangler, which mentioned Sister Robin's murder. Holes did confirm that the DNA comparison has still not taken place yet, as it sounds like there might be a lot of red tape involved with getting the tissue samples. I guess if these samples no longer exist, exhuming Shoplack's body might be the only way to get a sample of his DNA, and I'm sure that would also involve a lot of red tape. During this same episode, Holes also confirmed that even though a vaginal swab had been taken to collect a sperm sample back in 1977, it was inexplicably thrown out, and the only remaining samples of the killer's DNA were taken from dried semen on Sister Robin's pubic hairs. Unfortunately, it sounds like there just isn't enough existing DNA evidence to use genetic genealogy as a resource to solve this case. From what I've heard about him, John Shoplack does seem like a promising candidate to be the killer, but since he's no longer with us, it sounds like the only way to conclusively prove or disprove this would be through DNA testing. If it turns out not to be a match, then I guess the investigation can move on to other leads, and it sounds like law enforcement will not give up until they solve this one. Overall, I am inclined to think that Sister Robin's murder has no connection to any of the crimes from Washington County, and while it's nice that some of these cases have wound up being solved these past few decades, there are others which still require a resolution. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Sister Roberta Elam, as well as the unsolved murders of Barbara Lewis, Susan Rush, or Brenda Lee Ritter, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode about a famous case which was once featured on Unsolved Mysteries. The 1987 attack on Jenny Pratt, who was hit in the back of the head with a 2x4 by the occupants of a speeding truck, a crime which left her with considerable brain damage, but the perpetrators were never caught. I'm also going to start dropping the occasional exclusive bonus episode on Patreon from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, as this past month, we released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the Aileen Conway case from Unsolved Mysteries, which was also the subject of my debut episode of The Trail Went Cold. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I have also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Anna H.G., Neil C., Sarah B., Tracy V., Crystal G., Catherine C., and Lil J. Thank you all so much for your support. And in just under 2 months, provided that it's safe enough to travel there, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing on Podcastro at the very first CrimeCon UK, which is being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on the weekend of September the 25th and 26th. If you would like to purchase tickets to the event, we have a special promo code you can use to get a 10% discount. So to receive 10% off, visit crimecon.co.uk and enter the promo code COLD21. That's COLD21. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.